Breaking just moments ago, the news that General H.R. McMaster, who is the second national security advisor for the Trump administration, will be leaving that post in early April. Former U.S. ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, will be his replacement. Moments ago, President Trump breaking the news, as he often does, about our next guest, sending out this tweet. I am pleased to announce that effective April 9, Ambassador John Bolton will be my new national security advisor. I'm very thankful for the service of General H.R. McMaster, who has done an outstanding job and will always remain my friend. There will be an official contact handover on April the 9th. Here now, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, former Fox News contributor. Good to have you here this evening, sir. Your reaction to your new job?
Well, I think I still am a Fox News contributor.
No, you're not, apparently.
I didn't, well, I haven't started there yet. So that demonstrates, I think, the sort of limbo that, that I'm in, because I didn't really expect an announcement this afternoon. But it's obviously a great honor. It's always an honor to serve our country. And I think particularly in these times internationally, it's a particular honor. So I'm still sort of getting used to it, and I'm sure it'll take a little more getting used to.
So you were at the White House this afternoon, and the president offered you this position then or before then?
Well, it came to a conclusion this afternoon, and but as I say, there's still a transition. I look forward to working with HR and his team and the other senior members of the president's team on national security, and I have no doubt there's a lot of work to do, and so I'll be devoting myself to getting ready to fill in for HR.
But let me ask you this, because one of the stories that was out this week in the Washington Post suggested that the president ignored the advice of someone who was involved in the national security conversation not to congratulate Vladimir Putin when he spoke with him on the phone the other day. Is there any indication that that was the final catalyst that may have provoked this change?
No, I don't. I have no idea about any of that. I will say, when I read about the leak of the notes and the subject of the conversation, I was outraged by it. I mean, it recalled earlier in the administration when somebody was leaking transcripts of the president's conversations with foreign leaders. It's completely unacceptable. You cannot conduct diplomacy. You cannot expect other foreign leaders to be candid and open in their conversations with the president if some munchkin in the executive branch decides they're going to leak the talking points of the transcript or any other aspect of it. And I think this is really a terrible reflection on the individual or individuals who did this. They should be ashamed of themselves. And I think whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or a conservative, there ought to be unity on this point that leaking of that sort is simply unacceptable.
So in terms of the substance of that discussion with Vladimir Putin, you know, your thoughts on the fact that the president did congratulate him on his election?
I don't consider it a significant point one way or the other, really. I've said congratulations to a lot of people, foreign diplomats and officials. It's a matter of being polite. The president had other subjects to bring up, according to press reporting. I was not involved in any way in the preparations for it. The election just took place, and I think it's a matter of courtesy more than anything else.
Understood. But that aside, you know, I think in general, Ambassador Bolton, the way that you speak about Russia is quite a bit more hawkish than the way that the president does. In fact, you know, just in terms of being outspoken on this recent poisoning, you talked about the fact that chemical weapons poisons were used against Russians in London, and that is something that needs a very forceful response. Is that, you know, what kind of response would you encourage the president to undertake as national security advisor?
Well, you know, in the 45 minutes or an hour since I understood the tweet went out, I've been trying to think about how to answer questions like that. So I'll give you my first impression. You know, during my career, I've written, I don't know how many articles and op-eds and opinion pieces I've given. I can't count the number of speeches. I've had countless interviews, maybe a majority of them on Fox in the past 11 years. They're all out there on the public record. I've never been shy about what my views are, but frankly, what I've said in private now is behind me, at least effective April the 9th. And the important thing is is what the president says and what advice I give him. So with respect to the second part of your question, I don't think it's appropriate to tell you what advice I would give him. I mean, I think this is part of the difficulty of being in this limbo position tonight.
I understand that. You know, I was listening to right when the news broke, Special Report had their panel on, and you know, obviously the questions that initially come to mind are that you are obviously a person who is very strong-headed in your beliefs about things. It's gotten you into trouble at times in the past. There was, you know, one indication, I think, on Twitter that said that you promised the president that you wouldn't start any fights. Is that true, or is that the sort of mean that you want to come into the White House with as more diplomatic than you've been seen in the past, or are you going in there to shake things up?
You know, if I believed half of what I saw on Twitter, I'd probably withdraw from the world, which some people would prefer. Look, I have my views. I'm sure I'll have a chance to articulate them to the president. Some people don't like people who have substantive views. They're more process-oriented. But it's if the government can't have a free interchange of ideas among the president's advisors, then I think the president is not well served. And
let me ask you this: with regard to that,
because throughout government,
you know, it seems as though the one person who's sort of left is General Mattis, who believes that the Iran deal should be maintained. You've made it very clear in your writings, in your interviews, that you think that deal is an awful deal that needs to be scrapped. Is he the odd man out now?
You know, for the reasons I just explained, I've said what I've said about the Iran deal before. I'm not sure I've ever met General Mattis, so I'm not going to opine on what his views are, what he said to the president in private, or what discussions we may have the opportunity to have.
In terms of North Korea, do you believe that the president should sit down with Kim Jong-un? You have also said that the military option is needs to be in the forefront, I guess might be a fair way to say it, from, you know, the statements that you've made, that it should absolutely never be off the table. Do you think he should meet with him?
You give a great interview. Same question, same answer.
All right, so I understood, and I do appreciate the fact that you came in 45 minutes after this announcement was made, and that you are, as you say, you know, in a bit of limbo. I guess, you know, just a big picture question for you. How do you want to have an impact on the White House in this job? You know, how do you see yourself changing perhaps the tenor of this administration, if you do?
Well, look, any president is entitled to have a national security decision-making structure the way he wants to have it. And the system is designed to be flexible. Different presidents have different approaches, different styles. But I think the consensus would be that the National Security Advisor, among whatever other functions he or she might have, has two critical roles. Number one, making sure that the president has the full range of options presented to him to make the decisions that only the president can make, and that the options have to be presented in a way that gives the president the chance to weigh the pluses and minuses of all the options being presented. I think that's key, and I think that is sometimes described as an honest broker role. I think the National Security Advisor, if the president wants to hear his opinion, will give it as well. That's sort of one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is when the president makes a decision, the National Security Advisor is, among others, but certainly one of the leading implementers of the decision, making sure that the bureaucracies out there get the decision and implement it. And I've been in lots of bureaucracies, and I've seen the way that bureaucracies that don't like decisions sit on them. So I know my way around the corridors in Washington, and I think that that role will also be important. So those are the sort of two sides of the coin, I think, of the central role for the advisor.
So what I'm hearing in that, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that although you are an opinionated, outspoken person, if the president does not want to take the advice that you're giving him, you will make sure that the White House is presenting a united front?
Absolutely. You know, Jim Baker, who taught me an awful lot about politics, about foreign affairs, used to end most discussions about things where clearly my suggestion wasn't going anywhere by saying, because, John, the guy who got elected doesn't want to do it. And I think that the rest of the bureaucracy needs to understand as well, when the guy who got elected makes a decision, that's what the Constitution provides. And there's a famous story about Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State in the Truman administration, was asked by a reporter, maybe somebody like you, how is it that Acheson and President Truman had such a good working relationship? And Acheson said, basically, because neither the president nor I ever forgot who was president.
Well, this is an interesting president. And he does things in a very different way. There's discussion that if, John Kelly does decide to leave, that maybe the president wouldn't replace a chief of staff. Maybe he would, sort of run things more on his own. Do you think that would be a wise decision?
If I were a completely private citizen, I might have a view on that, but I'm not sure that in the present circumstances I'm going to comment on that one either. Sorry.
Well, let me ask you a more personal question then, because you're someone who, over the years, has entertained the idea of running for president at times. There was discussion that you would be considered as Secretary of State at times during the construction of this administration. So on a personal level, how do you feel about the job that you've been offered and what it means for you and your life and your future?
Well, it's still sinking in, so I haven't thought about it a great deal.
But you've clearly been thinking about it over the past few weeks, because I know you've made a few visits to the White House over the past few weeks, and no doubt you've had conversations. I mean, in terms of the way that the impact that you can have on America, on being in the White House, on being that close to the president. I know that you feel strongly about this president and that his potential is I know you've said you believe he has enormous potential. So what do you think John Bolton can bring to the table?
I know you've said more about my views than I have, which is an interesting observation. But look, the National Security Advisor, like all of the president's top advisors, serve at his pleasure, and he may be a different kind of president than others, but I think that's what the people voted for, and that's the role I've been asked to take on, that I sought, certainly, and that I'm pleased to have accepted it and honored to carry it out. We'll see what happens.
All right. I want to ask you one question about the topic that we originally brought you on to talk about tonight, Ambassador, because you've been, I respect the fact that you are here tonight, and it's good to talk.
This is the longest interview on Fox that I've ever had, and probably one where I've answered the fewest questions. So congratulations.
Well,
it's a mutual record, I'm sure.
We're working on it here. In terms of the backup on appointments, and it's interesting because you also went through a very delayed appointment process when for your ambassadorship to the UN, which I believe ended up in a recess appointment in the Bush administration. So you don't have to go through that process this time, but other people do. And they are very backed up, as you know. Rick Grinnell, who worked with you at the United Nations, is one of the people who is waiting and waiting and waiting. And the process is such that there have to be 60 hours of debate and discussion in the Senate, which is pretty hard to put together, given the work week in the Senate. So your thoughts on what can be done to make that process move more quickly?
Well, I think the confirmation process is so far out of control. It is nothing like today what the framers of the Constitution intended. I think the Senate rules are being grotesquely abused, and I think it's just it brings government to a grinding halt. Fundamentally, I think the Senate's role for executive branch nominees, different for judicial nominees because they have life tenure, really is not to be exercised simply because senators of the opposition party disagree with the philosophy of the incumbent president and the people he's trying to put in positions. So I think steps ought to be taken really to give people an up or down vote. If senators want to vote against them, that's obviously their prerogative. But have a vote. Stand out in the rain. Do what you're elected to do. Don't hide in procedural delays.
John Bolton, sir, very good to have you with us tonight. Obviously a lot to talk about, and we hope to continue the conversation as you move into this new, very important position as you take on the next chapter of your life at the White House as the National Security Advisor, April 9th. Ambassador, thank you. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thanks very much for having me.
You bet.